Christ. Amen. Hear this reading from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Hear what God is saying to the people. Thanks be to God.
Why does this always happen to me? Every time that I have to preach on an assigned lectionary text, it turns out that the passage is one that has caused me enormous spiritual distress, one that I have spent countless hours trying to reinterpret so that it would be less troublesome to my spirit. I don't volunteer to wrestle with these texts of terror. They are assigned to me by Professor Williams, who either has a hidden sadistic streak or is controlled by a malevolent providence. Problem is, I was raised in a conservative evangelical context in which reading scripture devotionally and applying it to one's own life was prized as the paramount mark of a mature Christian. During the summer between the 7th and 8th grade, I had an attack of piety. I figured that now I was mature, and therefore it was time to get serious about the Christian life. So I resolved to read the Old and New Testaments in tandem, straight through. Things went smoothly with the New Testament until I reached Matthew 16, 21 and 28. After announcing his impending suffering and death, Jesus says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. The implication was clear. The Christian life is the way of the cross, the mournful trudge to Golgotha. And that means suffering. To make it worse, it did not sound like this way of the cross was optional. It sounded like a non-negotiable feature of the Christian life. I did not want to hear that stuff about self-denial. I looked forward to a life of joy and self-actualization, a life of oil painting, playing in a rock band, dating, going to college. Suffering with Jesus was not a remote part of my life ambition. Now, I was not alone in my allergic reaction to this passage. Critics like the philosopher Nietzsche have denounced self-sacrifice as a glamorization of a life-negating masochism. Freud analyzed it as a form of anger towards social norms that had been perversely turned inward. and various groups of marginalized and oppressed people, from racial minorities to women and to the victims of various imperialisms, have objected that they have heard quite enough about self-sacrifice. They've been forced to subordinate their own well-being to the needs and desires of their overlords. From this perspective, such texts, especially when read as loving your enemy and turning the other cheek, seem like an invitation to be a doormat and give the oppressor a blank check to keep on oppressing. Now, these suspicions and objections are entirely legitimate. But is the sweeping revulsion to Matthew appropriate? Is Matthew's Jesus a masochist, a life denier? Well, maybe not. See, this passage can be reframed. And in various forms of Christianity, it has been reframed by reading it in the light of the love motif in the Epistle of James. Zinzendorf did that. Wesley did that. Kierkegaard did that. Martin Luther King Jr. did that. And Simone Weil did that. Not a bad cloud of witnesses there. And when it's read in this way, its message can be stated simply. In the famous words of the band Nazareth from 1976, love hurts. The reality is that any commitment or attachment to another person or community or project requires us to do things that are inconvenient, unpleasant, inopportune, and maybe even painful and dangerous. Parents of newborns know this intimately as they get up in the middle of the night to change diapers, feed hungry mouths, and comfort cries of distress of unknown origin. Nobody wants to interrupt their sleep in this way, but love for one's children requires it. These acts of care are little crosses that we must take up out of love. They are micro acts of self-sacrifice. And as our loves become more intensive and extensive, so the need to sacrifice our immediate desires and wishes increases. This is simply the way the biological and social world is. And because we live in a world that is fallen and sinful, we need to sacrifice our personal comfort and well-being in order to love that's multiplied exponentially. Many Christians have been acutely aware of this reality and have resolutely faced it. Take Anabaptists, folks who are pacifists, practice believers' baptism, and were condemned as heretics by other Christians. Mennonites, a major variant of Anabaptism, are notoriously suspicious of the use of religious visual images. But many Mennonite homes and the hallways of Mennonite churches display prints of the story of Dirk Willem, taken from the Martyr's Mirror. In the 16th century in the Netherlands, Dirk had been convicted as an Anabaptist by the Catholic government. Through great ingenuity and daring, he escaped from the castle prison and raced over the ice that covered the castle moat, pursued by a castle guard. Dirk, who was very lightweight because of the meager prison rations, crossed the ice safely. However, his heavier, well-fed pursuer broke through and began to sink into the freezing water. Hearing the guard's frantic cries for help, Dirk walked gingerly back over the thin ice and pulled him out. The ungrateful guard then seized Dirk and returned him to prison. Very soon after, Dirk was convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. In a fallen world, such is the price of loving your enemy. No good deed goes unpunished. Mennonites have concluded that radical compassion is so countercultural that it inevitably invites hostility and violence. In an unloving world, the example of genuine compassion makes everyone else feel uncomfortable, guilty. And so such examples of love have to be removed. Throughout Christian history, examples of the connection of love and self-sacrifice abound. In 1956, during the bus boycott in Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr. received an angry phone call. The unidentified voice said, "We are tired of you and your mess now. And if you aren't out of this town in 3 days, we're going to blow your brains out and blow up your house." The king had received death threats before, many times, but this one sounded different to him. This guy sounded like he meant business. King recalled that he stumbled to his kitchen filled with fear and tried to calm himself, realizing that the lives of his young daughter and wife were in danger. He considered taking the comfortable path and giving up on the civil rights movement. Then he bowed his head over a cup of coffee and implored God for wisdom and strength. He later recalled, "And it seemed at the moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, 'Martin, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world.'" King went on to say that Jesus promised never to leave me alone. So out of love for his neighbors, out of love for the movement, out of love for justice for all, King kept on going. And just 3 days after the ominous phone call, King's house was indeed bombed. Although his wife and daughter were at home, no one was injured. Yes, love hurts. Now, the way of the cross is not necessarily so dramatic or world historical as King's path. The crosses that we bear may seem smaller and less consequential. I had a friend who shall remain nameless because I think some of you might have known him, a bit older than me, a theologian who was creative, learned, and prolific. Giving all his talents and accomplishments, it was almost inevitable that he would be ambitious. Now, the thing we need to remember is that the academic world can be ferociously competitive, and teaching positions are hard to get. My friend taught at a small, relatively unknown liberal arts college, where his talents would mostly go unrecognized by the rest of the world. But after a few years, his books were so well respected that in a single year, he got job offers from Princeton Theological Seminary, Union Theological Seminary, Yale Divinity School, and the University of Virginia. All of these would have been extraordinarily coveted offers. Now, I could tell that he was salivating to be associated with one of those premier institutions. Any one of those positions would have been his dream come true, the holy grail of his vocational quest. But he turned them all down and remained for the rest of his career, he died young, at his small, obscure college. Before he passed, I asked him why he had walked away from the very thing that he had always yearned for. He replied, "Well, rejecting the offers hurt me more than you can imagine. I was haunted by my decision and I had to get therapy. But I kept thinking that my college needs me and that I can have a bigger impact here than I can at some high-powered research institution. The college's needs trumps my personal desires." So for him too, love hurt. And the same story can be told of pastors who stick it out in their small, struggling congregations and resist the allure of a big steeple church. Now, don't get me wrong. For most Christians, this recognition that love requires self-sacrifice and self-sacrifice requires suffering does not entail that we should go out and look for opportunities to suffer. We are not required to court martyrdom. In the early 16th century, Thomas More, a devout Catholic and one-time chancellor for Henry VIII, did not approve of the king's divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, for biblical reasons. Now, the king required that all his subjects, including More, take an oath of loyalty to any heirs that might be the fruit of his proposed second marriage. In the play A Man for All Seasons, More's daughter asks him how he could possibly take the oath. He replies, "Listen, Meg, God made the angels to show his splendor, and he made animals for innocence and plants for their simplicity. But humans he made to serve him wittily in the tangle of their minds. If God suffers us to come to such a case that there is no escaping, then we may stand to our tackle as best we can. And yes, Meg, we can then clamor like champions, if we have the spittle for it. But it's God's part, not our own, to bring ourselves to such a pass. Our natural business lies in escaping. If I can take the oath, I will." Sadly, once more saw the wording, he realized that he could not take the oath and was duly beheaded. But he was a reluctant martyr. So we must all be, not seeking crucifixions little or big, but bracing ourselves to accept those crosses when they appear. So all this stuff about self-giving and self-sacrifice probably does sound pretty foreboding and offensive, after all, doesn't it? It flies in the face of our instincts for self-preservation and self-fulfillment. Or does it? What if there is a kind of self-fulfillment that comes from breaking out of the confines of our narrow little worlds, out of the prison houses of our own self-interests? What if our hearts taste the exhilaration of expansion as we learn to love God and neighbor more and more extravagantly? What if our hearts are stretched wide enough to embrace the entire universe, something Jonathan Edwards called consent to being in general? What if we can learn to take exuberant delight not only in neighbors, but also in strangers and enemies? I spoke with my friend at that little liberal arts college a few days before his demise. He reflected, "You know, staying here was the right decision. In a curious way, I have been happy, even though the anguish of surrendering my most cherished hopes hurt. But through that, I have been happy." And then he paused and added with an enigmatic smile, "There is joy in the cross." Yes, love hurts, but the pain conceals a deeper and more paradoxical fulfillment. True self-actualization comes through giving oneself away. We gain our lives by losing them. Love hurts, but it also enlivens. Thanks be to God.